Hello and welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all. Thank you so much for coming to this Terra.do guest talk with Dr. Robert Davies. It's great to see so many of you that I've seen before, and I think I see some new faces as well, so that's great to see as well. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Greg Findley, and I'm the director of Terra.do's 12-week flagship course, Climate Change Learning for Action. And this talk today is the keynote for the fellows in our newly launched Lemurs cohort of this Learning for Action program. And it's also one of the expert guest talks for the fellows in our ongoing Koalas cohort. These two cohorts together represent nearly 300 fellows from more than 30 countries, and they come from a broad range of professional backgrounds. For those of you who don't know about the program, the Learning for Action course is an intensive exploration of climate science, climate impacts, and climate solutions. And it's a combination of written classes and live weekly lab sessions, deep dives, and expert guest talks and workshops. And all of it is intended to help our fellows learn about climate change so they can find their role in working to address it. Terra.do was founded in 2020 with an ambitious goal of getting 100 million people working on climate change this decade. We offer a new cohort of our Learning for Action course starting every 6 weeks, and we urge you to check it out if you want to learn more about how you can become involved in addressing climate change. And our next cohort begins on September 3rd. Before we get started, I want to go over a few points about this Zoom session. Please mute yourself. I think everyone is pretty aware of all of these things, but please mute yourself so we can hear our speaker. Following the talk, we'll have some time for questions and answers. Although initially, at least, we'll take the answers or the questions from our current fellows using Slido. And fellows, you could have found that in Slack this morning. I'm incredibly excited that Rob Davies is here with us today. I first learned about Rob when I was working with the city of Bozeman, Montana, helping them set climate goals and then create an action plan to meet those goals. And the mayor and some other city officials had attended a Mountain Towns 2030 Climate Solutions Conference where Rob was a speaker alongside renowned conservationist Jane Goodall and Project Drawdown founder Paul Hawken. And the mayor and everyone who attended came back and reported that it was an incredible conference, but most importantly, Rob's talk had kind of rocked them and moved them to take climate action. I've since seen Rob speak at multiple other events and invited him to be a keynote at our Wyoming Climate Conference a couple of years ago. And I'm just thrilled that he's here with us today. So Robert Davies is a physicist whose work focuses on complexity, global change, human vibrancy, and critical science communication. Rob has delivered hundreds of public lectures to policymakers, business leaders, civic organizations, and faith communities. And his performance science theatrical collaboration, The Crossroads Project, Rising Tide, has been performed across the US and in 3 countries. Dr. Davies has served as a scientific liaison for NASA on the International Space Station project, as a project scientist with Utah State University's Space Dynamics Laboratory, and an officer and meteorologist in the US Air Force. He's currently associate professor of professional practice with Utah State University's Department of Physics, and I'm thrilled to pass it over to Rob. Rob, thank you for being with us, and take it away, please.
Wow, well, thank you so much, Greg. It's just really great to be here. I only recently, and I don't even understand why this is true, but I only recently learned of this course and Terra.do, and it looks incredible. It's a privilege to be here with all of you and for you to spend time listening to what I have to say. So first of all, let me say thank you for your work and for your interest in all of this. I am going to, so I don't know if you all read the little blurb that I sent out. I talked about having a kind of a great truth that a lot of us aren't working with and need to know, and it's initially counterintuitive and kind of goes against a lot of our conditioning, but once we take it in, it just completely, I think, makes sense. I find this is true with the students that I teach here at Utah State University, and I'm hoping that will be true for you. So let me just, let me share my screen here and we'll get started. And okay, great. So let me start by saying, here's the title of your course, Climate Change Learning for Action. And I want to focus for a moment on this word. There we go. I want to focus on for a moment on this word action and talk about what it means to actually have meaningful action in the realm of climate change. And I'm just going to start with maybe a picture. So for example, this might look like meaningful action. Over the last 2 decades or so, installed solar photovoltaic capacity. This is solar panels generating power, and you can see just a dramatic climb in that since the year 2000. So that would seem like authentic progress. That would seem like a good thing to do for action. But what is it we're trying to do with climate change? I mean, if the notion with climate change is we need to stop the climate change, we need to reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, all greenhouse gas levels, sort of as a proxy carbon dioxide. And to do that, we really need the single biggest source of that by far is the burning of fossil fuels. We need to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels. So here's the consumption of fossil fuels over that same time frame. The United Nations Convention on Climate Change was in 1992. The world committed itself to addressing this problem 3 decades ago. We've known about the problem for the phenomenon and the likely problem for roughly a century. And so we've got all of this installed renewable zero carbon energy, and it hasn't had a single effect on our consumption of climate change. And of course, what we really want to do moving down the line is to reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. There's the graph for atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. So despite 3 decades of work, trillions of dollars committed to all kinds of different projects and programs to address climate change, we haven't moved the needle at all. And so this notion of why is that? Why is it that we have so many people working on this and we need so many more, with governments making agreement after meeting after meeting, and we haven't moved the needle at all? We're not even bending the curve. We're not even converging on an answer. It's not like it's just happening slowly. Everything we've done is not mitigating the problem. It's not even converging on a mitigation of the problem. And just to give a longer history here, here's fossil fuel use, coal, oil, and natural gas going back to the start of the 19th century. And you can see there that the global wide trend is just up and up and up, despite even in our last 3 decades. And these little dips here that you see are not because of the actions we've taken. Those little dips are just because of economic recessions, downturns in the economy. And as soon as the economy growth starts coming back up, you see the use in fossil fuels going. Right back up. Okay. And then, of course, we see headlines like this. I just pulled this. I just do a quick scan of The Guardian the other day and found this one. So despite all of the agreements, despite all of the work, it doesn't look like things are moving. And if we think about our lives, if we think about the news headlines we hear about just how things are going in the world with respect to climate change, this makes intuitive sense. On the one hand, we hear about all of the conversion to EVs. We hear about a just transition to a low carbon, zero carbon energy system. We hear about photovoltaic installations, wind. We hear about zero carbon energy. But then we also hear about things like this, a continued betting on economic well-being on fossil fuels. So that brings up the notion then of this concept of what is authentic progress. And in order to address what I just said, I'm going to have to tell a broader story. And so what we're really dealing with here is stories embedded within stories, embedded within stories. So let me start with this first story, the broadest we can think of. This is a story that we're working in, that we're living in, that of where we are, where we want to be, and how we transition from where we are to where we want to be. So let me start with so the notion here of the transition, of course, being we're standing at the foot of a mountain that nobody's climbed. I kind of like this metaphor, and we're trying to figure out how to get up there, and we can see all kinds of routes from base camp that kind of look like they might take us up there. And we need to figure this out, and we're not going to figure it out every step before we get going. We can't see every step to the top of the mountain. What we do need to figure out are what are the next steps? What are the next steps that we're going to commit ourselves to and seem like they're most likely to get us there? So this is the broadest story. And this notion of where we want to be, let me just simply state this for the sake of argument, and let's just take this for the sake of argument. We want to be sustainable, we want to be just, and we want to be vibrant. And by sustainable, I mean biophysically sustainable, living within the means of our living planet to provide us with the things that we need to survive and to thrive and to absorb the waste products that we produce. We want to be just. A sustainable state is always guaranteed because the definition of something that's unsustainable is it's not going to last. So eventually, whatever it is that's unsustainable will be sustainable. It will be in a different state. There are lots of sustainable states for humans, but we want very specific ones. Most of those sustainable states are not very pleasant. We want the ones that are just and that are vibrant. And let me add one more piece to this. We want that for all creatures on the planet, because we cannot have a sustainable, just, and vibrant state for human civilization unless it is sustainable and vibrant for all living things, for the biosphere on the planet that supports us. And we want it to be this way for all time, not just our generation, but for future generations as well. So that's where we want to be. Where are we? Now, I want to spend a fair bit of time now on this notion of where we are. And that is yet another nested story here. And where we are is inhabiting a landscape of ecological and social crises. There are different terms for this. Some people will call it a polycrisis or a meta-crisis. Think of it as a crisis of crises. And that's because the first thing we want to understand about this landscape is that each of these ecological and social crises in and of themselves is inextricably connected to the others. We are fully, wholly entangled with each other. Now, I've chosen a few here to highlight. You can categorize these somewhat differently. And of course, you've signed up to learn about climate change. And I think we all know the basic story of climate change. The Earth is warming. This warming is due entirely to us humans and from our activity, primarily from the burning of fossil fuels and the raising of greenhouse gases. That global warming, that anthropogenic global warming, is disrupting the entire planetary climate system. That's climate change. And if we continue on our current trajectory, the impacts for humans and the human ecosystem are catastrophic. And to be clear, it has already been catastrophic for some people and some places and some species and some landscapes. And it's on its way from going to some places for some people some of the time to all places, all people, all the time. So that's the story of climate change in a nutshell. But we have these other related but separate crises. So, for example, the biosphere is undergoing an essential collapse at this point. Some of the ecologists have called it a sixth great extinction. We have lost 70% of the wild creatures. Human beings have wiped out 70% of the Earth's wild creatures in the last 50 years. 1 million species out of an estimated 10 to 12 million species on the planet. 1 million are at risk of extinction in the next 6 to 8 decades. And most of that impact to the biosphere is not from climate change. About 85%, the ecologists tell us, is from hyper-extraction and hyper-pollution, the decimation of habitats, not from climate change. Now, as climate change accelerates, of course, that will increase the effect. But right now, the effects to the biosphere are primarily not from climate change. We also live in a society that is hyper-inequitable. So the effects of the collapsing biosphere and of climate change and of a whole suite of other ecological challenges are highly disproportionately felt across the planet. And the wealth of the planet is highly disproportionately distributed. About 80%, about 20%, excuse me, of us on the planet, of the 8 billion of us on the planet, are responsible for about 80% of the consumption and the impact. It gets even worse that just a couple of dozen people in the entire world control as much wealth as the poorest 4 billion people. A couple of dozen people on the planet control as much wealth as the poorest 4 billion. 3 individuals in the United States control as much wealth as the poorest 200 million, the poorest half of us in the United States. So when we say inequitable, we don't mean that the family down the street has a somewhat nicer house and a cooler car. We mean a dramatic inequitable distribution of wealth and a dramatically inequitable experience of the impacts that we're having on the biosphere. Finally, our civilization is deeply unsustainable. And I want to talk about that right now, and I want to talk about how unsustainable we are. So the short answer is no. Are we? And when I say sustainable, I mean biophysically sustainable. And there are a number of frameworks that tell us this. The first one is a relatively recent framework, only about 15 years old, called the Planetary Boundaries Framework. And this framework looks at critical Earth system processes required to keep us in a state to which civilization can exist and thrive. That is, a state to which our human civilization has evolved and is naturally selected now to be in. And scientists identified essentially 9 boundaries. They're kind of what you would think. They have to do with the climate system, with the living systems, with land systems, freshwater systems, the oceans, with nutrients, and with the atmosphere. And the way that they've organized this is to say, well, how much can we disrupt the operation of those systems and still expect to stay in this state that can sustain human civilization? And how much have we disrupted them? And the idea is to identify a safe space boundary. How much have we disrupted that particular thing, say climate change or biosphere integrity, or how much chemical pollution have we added, and how much can we add without endangering ourselves? And what we find is that out of the 9 planetary boundaries, disrupting even one of them beyond the safe space puts at risk the ability of human civilization to continue. We have now disrupted 6 of these boundaries beyond the safe operating space in this framework. And not just a little beyond, but much beyond. The addition of chemical pollution, quantified, one of the quantifications there is by plastic pollutions, the amount we've disrupted the climate system, the amount we've disrupted the living system, the biosphere, the amount we've disrupted freshwater systems, nutrient flows, land systems, all way beyond the amount we can expect to disrupt them and keep a sustainable, vibrant human civilization. Furthermore, in the 15 years since this framework was introduced, 15 years ago, we had crossed 3 boundaries. About 10 years ago, 4 boundaries, and as of last year, now 6 boundaries. So our impacts are dramatically increasing. There's another framework that we can look at to say, well, is our human civilization sustainable? That's called an ecological footprint. And in this system, in this framework, we look at, well, how much land and water area is necessary to provide us with the things that we use and absorb the wastes that we excrete. And in this framework, we find that somewhere in the 1970s, we crossed the boundary of needing more than 1 planet's worth of surface area and resources to sustain us. As of last year, we're at nearly 1.8 planets worth of resources to sustain our current level of human activity, our current civilization. So this would tell us then, from a planetary boundaries framework and an ecological footprint, we are deeply, deeply unsustainable. We are drawing down the natural world, and we are deepening our ecological debt. It leads to papers like this coming from the scientific community, which do not sound promising. And these are not coming from just a couple of people working in their basements. These come from huge numbers of studies, drawing on large numbers of research groups. So no, we're not sustainable. And the question then is, as we move back to this story of the impacts that we're having, why is that? We want to get at the core reasons. And what we find is that all of these, this landscape is connected through sort of the tectonic forces that are generating these impacts. Our food system, our energy system, our increasingly polluted information system, which makes it increasingly difficult for us to actually act. And we get those systems from our economic system. This is a neoclassical economic system that's been in place for roughly 100 years. And the very foundation of that economic system is the notion of economic growth. And when I say growth here, I don't mean improvement. I don't mean modernization. I don't mean getting better. We don't mean getting more vibrant. We simply mean getting bigger. And by getting bigger, we mean more and more economic activity as measured in US dollars. And this is something that we don't actually think about. It's just the ocean we swim in. It's like asking the fish, what do you think of the water? And the fish says, well, what's water? And so, not to keep you in suspense too much longer, the great truth that we have to face is that this whole meta crisis, this suite of ecological and challenges that we are facing, is all emergent from a macroeconomic paradigm of continued economic growth. Our economic system must grow in order to thrive. In fact, it must grow a certain amount. If it goes much below 2%, we call it a recession. If it stays there for very long, we call it a depression. And so it's this notion of growth and economic growth that I want to use as the context for the actions that we take on climate change. Now, this can sound pretty daunting, but it's also going to be quite clarifying. So let's move back to our pathways between where we are and where we want to be. And we're going to call all the possible pathways that could take us to where we want to be. We'll call that the solution space. And what we need to do is bound the solution space and say, well, which paths can actually take us where we want to go and which ones can't? And the hard boundary on that solution space is not economics, it's not social, it's not cultural. The hard boundary on that solution space is physics. In other words, if your plan to get us to a sustainable, just, and vibrant space involves time machines or turning off gravity or warp drives or perpetual motion machines, then that pathway is not inside the solution space. It is not possible. It's not because we're not clever enough. It's because physics unequivocally will not allow it. And so it's this framework then that I want to move forward, and I want to contend that essentially every pathway that we are traversing right now is outside the solution space. And that's because every pathway that we're traversing requires us to violate fundamental physics, and specifically it requires us to violate this one right here, the creation of perpetual motion machines. So what do I mean by that? Okay, well, no magic allowed. Authentic progress means no pathways that require magic. Now, there are, of course, other boundaries that are, and these are social and ecological, political, economic, and it's not to say they're easy to get around those. But what's to say is there's no physics preventing us from doing these pathways that we're going to talk about. They may be hard, but they're not impossible, and hard is infinitely better than impossible. So the premise here is the physical certainty is that economic growth is going to end. And the data tells us that this is going to happen very soon. I want to describe this conclusion and what it means for us as we move forward in choosing how we choose to act with climate change. And what I want to do is introduce the notion of a metabolism and apply it to our economy. And this works actually really quite well. So what is a metabolism? We've all heard about a metabolism. Well, this is pretty easy. Organisms, any organisms, extract stuff from the environment. They use that stuff to create energy to do more stuff. We build ourselves, we build our own bodies, and we do things like gather things to build nests and to build homes and to sow crops, and we excrete waste. So this is a metabolism. We use stuff to get energy to do stuff, and we excrete waste. And this is really about flows, the flows of energy, the flows of material, and the flows of waste. And this notion of metabolism can apply not just to a single organism, but to whole populations of organisms, to whole populations of things like deer or grasshoppers or phytoplankton or people. And we can even apply it to whole communities. How much stuff and energy does your community extract from the environment and use to do things, and how much waste does your community produce, even whole civilizations. Now, to make this point clear and succinctly, I want to just focus on energy. And I'll find out why. So the first question is this, and forgive me, we're going to go through just a little bit of a physics lesson real quick. I promise we'll bring it back to the corral pretty quickly. And I think this is going to clarify things as we move forward. So the first question is, what is energy? We talk about energy, but what is it? And of course, here's the equation for energy, E equals mc squared, where E is energy and m is mass or stuff. It's probably the most famous scientific equation in the world, written down by perhaps the most famous scientist in the world, Einstein. And basically what this equation tells us is energy is stuff and stuff is energy. So energy is everything. For our purposes in talking about a civilizational metabolism, though, a better way to say it is energy is the master resource. Nothing happens without energy. There's lots of specific materials and resources we can do something without. We don't necessarily need rocks or wood or whatever it is you want to talk about to do lots of things, but we always need energy. It is the master resource. Why is that? What is it that energy does? In physics terms, what energy does is make things move. Energy makes things move. And any activity you can think of involves motion, any activity you can think of. Now, it might be macroscopic motion. You want to drive your car from here to the store, and so the car moves, and that requires energy to move the car. But it also might mean doing a computation on your computer, and it's just sitting there, and it's chugging away in the computation. You don't see any motion, but secretly, the electric charges inside the chips are moving around. And even if you just sit quietly and think, your brain requires electric charges inside the brain to move around in order to do that thinking. So without energy, nothing that we could consider energy activity happens. So any activity requires energy because any activity requires motion. Okay, so we need energy to do anything. Can we make energy? I think most of you know the answer is no, we can't do that. This is a law, a very firm physical law. It's a very important one, and so we give it a big name called the first law, and you've all heard it. Energy is neither created, destroyed, or destroyed, just moves from one thing to another. So for example, I get in my car, there's energy contained in the chemical bonds. We're going to get to that in a second. In the gasoline, I convert that, those energy there into motion. The car goes to the store, I bring it to a stop, and then you say, oh, well, what happened to the energy? It doesn't appear to be anywhere, but the energy is still there. We stopped, and in order to stop, we had to use the brakes. The brakes get hot, and heat, temperature, is secretly just a measure of the macroscopic motions of the atoms and molecules. We increased the motions of the atoms and molecules. The energy of the car as a whole went into the energy of the temperature of the brakes, of the atoms and molecules there. Okay, so we can't make energy. So we're going to have to find some energy. Where is energy? Energy is in two places. Energy is in moving things. I have a bowling ball, and I want to make the bowling pins move. And so I throw the bowling ball down the lane, and the energy of motion in the bowling ball turns into energy of motion of the pins. The moving bowling ball made the pins move. We can take the moving energy of the wind and turn it into the moving energy of wind turbines, which then generate electricity, which is turns into the motion of electrons in our wires. Electric charges. So moving things contain energy. So that's where we harvest the energy from, is from moving things. There's one other place, though, that energy is, and that is in the configuration of things. So I notch an arrow in a bow, and I draw the string, and there's a configuration, and I contend that there is energy in that configuration. And you'll say, well, nothing's moving. Where's the energy? But energy is what makes things move, and that configuration can make the arrow move. It's the same thing with chemical energy in atoms that are bound up in electrical bonds between the different atoms. Think of it as a little spring that's been compressed and that is kind of notched, but holding the atoms together. And when we induce a chemical reaction in which that spring releases that energy, then that chemical energy stored in the compressed spring turns into the motions of the atoms. And if we do it fast enough, we call it an explosion. And that's how we get energy from, say, hydrocarbon bonds of fossil fuels. Say gasoline is ignited, the chemical action gives motion to the atoms, and they move our car. So we can't make energy, but we can find it in configurations and moving things. Can we just use the same energy over and over again? The answer is no. This is also a law. The term first law was taken, so we're going to call it the second law. There it is written. That's carved on Ludwig von Boltzmann's headstone, who was the person who first articulated accurately the second law of thermodynamics. And the second law of thermodynamics is incredibly famous. It is perhaps the most foundational law in all of physics. And it can be stated in different ways. One way is to state that when energy shifts from one form to another, some of it leaks away. Now, it isn't lost because you can't create or destroy energy, but it's lost in terms of being able to do something. We call it waste heat. So let's go back to our automobile. We start with gasoline in the car, and we burn it. And some of that energy goes into making the pistons move, but some of it heats up the pistons as well. And so as we move from the gasoline to the pistons, some of it just goes into heating things up. And if we go from the pistons to the wheels, we lose a little bit more. And as we go to moving the car, we lose yet more. And now the car is moving. And along the way, we have lost some of the energy just to the thermal motions of the components. And again, it's not because we're not clever enough. It's because the physics of our universe will not allow us to use this energy completely 100% efficiently. We are always going to lose some into the waste heat. And then when it comes to a stop, of course, there it is in the components of our car. 100% efficiency is not allowed. And this is what we mean by perpetual motion machines. No perpetual motion machines. If you want something to keep moving, you have to keep adding energy. Another way to state the second law is that without a constant flow of energy, everything falls apart. So I need energy to build, let's say, a home or a bicycle or an automobile or a piece of clothing. But anyone, of course, who has any of those things knows that with time, the energy stored in that configuration of the piece of clothing or the home or the bicycle, interacting with the environment, causes things to break. Things will fall apart. And if we want to fix it, we can fix the bicycle. We need to invest some energy to put it back together. But then it just falls apart again. And if we leave it to its own devices, it will completely fall apart. So this is, again, the notion of a metabolism. This is what our bodies do. Our bodies are in constant state of decay. Those of us past the age of 50 probably feel this a little bit more than those of you who aren't. They require a constant flow of energy and materials to keep our bodies assembled and working, and this is the metabolism. And this is, again, a law of physics. So let's review the physics of energy. Energy is the master resource. You can't do anything without energy. Nothing that can be considered an activity can be done without energy. We can't use that energy 100% efficiently. And again, it's not because we're not clever enough. We can use it to a maximum level of efficiency, but once we get to that maximum level, which is not 100%, then doing more requires more energy. That's because that energy leaks away. Some of it turns into waste heat. It's still there in the environment. We just can't use it to do anything useful. And this also means that without a constant flow of energy, everything falls apart. Do you ever notice that wherever you go, everything is under construction? Everything is always being rebuilt. Most of our economy is devoted to rebuilding what we have already built, just to maintaining what it is we're already doing. I lived for a couple of years in Oxford in the United Kingdom. This is a university that's been around for about 1,000 years. And what I noticed walking around the streets of Oxford every day was that everything was always under construction. Everything was being repaired. And of course, we see this every day. We can hardly move 3 blocks without running into road construction or a remodeling of a building or you name it. So let's apply this now to the notion of economic activity and how it is that this macroscopic model of perpetual growth is preventing us from making progress on the things we desperately need. Okay. We mean growth. By economic growth, we mean growth of economic activity. We mean nothing more. We don't mean things are getting better. We don't mean we're getting happier. We don't mean we're getting more modern. We don't mean we're making progress. We simply mean the activity is getting bigger. Now, economists will tell us that we can decouple our economic growth from materials and energy, meaning that we can continue to grow the economy without growing our energy and material use. And what the physics tells us is very clearly that this is not possible. This is utterly not possible. Now, the economists will point things out like efficiency. They say, well, we're getting much more efficient with things. So can efficiency actually decouple us? Let me first say that efficiency can be good. Generally speaking, it sounds like efficiency is what we want. We want to be able to get the same amount of utility out of, more utility out of the same amount of energy. But this is not decoupling. It simply means getting more efficient. Let me give you an example. As we grow the economy, let's say here's the GDP going up, our economic activity over time. If we do not get more efficient, then as we grow the GDP, the energy usage grows at the same rate. However, if we start to get more efficient with the way we're using the energy, we can, for example, when we replace incandescent lights with LED lights. LED lights are much more efficient at converting energy into light. So we need less energy to produce the same light, but we still need energy. So if we introduce that efficiency, as GDP goes up, the energy use goes up, but it doesn't go up as fast. So this is not decoupling. This is just getting more efficient. But economists say we can actually show you that there are times when energy goes down and GDP goes up. And so we're decoupling, but this is not decoupling. This is what happens when we introduce a really big efficiency really quickly. It can seem for a while like the GDP is going up, our utility is going up as energy use goes down. But as soon as we hit that efficiency limit, now we're doing this as efficiently as we can. Then as GDP goes up, the energy rises in lockstep as well. And this is what the physics tells us must happen. And we do see this in the data. Now, what about this word can? What do you mean efficiency can be good? Isn't efficiency definitely good? Well, this is something that's counterintuitive to most of us. But it turns out that if you take a gain in efficiency in any resource and plug it in to a growth-based economic system, you use more of that resource, not less. Let me say that again. In a growth-based economic system, an improvement in efficiency of a resource means that you use more of that resource, not less. How is that possible? This is sometimes called a rebound effect or a Jevons paradox. And here's just one example. So what we're looking at is energy since 1970, energy intensity. Look at the blue line. This means how much energy does it take to produce a unit of economic growth. And what we find is, as we move forward from, and this is normalized, so to 1970 numbers, as we move forward, it turns out that we've gotten considerably more efficient at using energy to produce economic activity. In fact, today we need about half as much energy to produce the same amount of economic activity that we did. Now that seems good. It seems like, okay, good. We can get all that utility by using less. But here's what's happened, the red line, to our energy consumption over that same period. We got more efficient, but the amount that we used went up. And that happens because in a growth-based economy, capital will always look for a way to grow. So if that energy is still useful, what the efficiency does is not mean you use less. What it means is you can use it to do more things that did not used to be economically viable. Energy is so cheap now that we use it to power our toothbrushes. So as you get more efficient, you can do things with that energy you weren't able to do previously that were not economically viable. That opens up new markets, and we can do all kinds of things, and it results in a growth in consumption. This is called the Jevons paradox, and one sees it in all kinds of materials in a growth-based economic system. Lots of data to this effect. So it accelerates consumption. Efficiency can be good, but if you don't plug that efficiency into a system that doesn't need to grow, then it turns out that doing this thing that we think is amazing, that's awesome, which is getting more efficient with our energy, actually increases the impact we're having on the environment. Now, this leads to, pardon me, sorry about that, where we are now. We cannot decouple economic activity from energy. We can decouple it from specific things occasionally. If we put all of the right policies in place, we have decoupled our economy, for example, from CFCs, which were causing ozone depletion, chlorofluorocarbons. But that required additional work. That required not letting the market work. That required actually setting public policy, banning the use of specific things. So we can decouple from specific things. We cannot decouple from all things. And from energy, no matter what, we cannot decouple economic activity from the use of energy. It's the master resource. Again, not because we're not clever enough, but because the universe won't allow it. So as we said, we're not sustainable. Sorry about that. I got a couple of extra slides here. Let me just show you this one more time. Since 1970, primary energy use is going up. Material extraction as well, if we want to talk not just about energy, but materials, is going up as well in lockstep with the increase in GDP. There's lots of research to tell us that not only can we not decouple from energy and materials, we are not decoupling from energy and materials. What's happened is we've gone from being a small world on a big planet, meaning the human civilizational metabolism was small compared to the planetary processes we're embedded in, to being a big world on a small planet. Meaning our human civilizational metabolism is now overwhelming the planetary Earth system processes in which we're embedded. So what does that mean moving forward? Where we are is roughly a factor of 2, 1.8, in overshoot of our resource capability. We are underwater. We need to be up here in the atmosphere where we can breathe, but where we are is underwater, deep underwater. But as we said, the definition of something that is unsustainable is that it won't last. So at some point in the future, we will be here. We will be sustainable. The question is, what does that state look like and how do we get there? On our current trajectory, now this is what we want to do, of course. On our current trajectory, what we are doing is this. We are currently roughly a factor of 2 into overshoot. On purpose, we will be a factor of 4 into overshoot in the next several decades and a factor of 8 into overshoot by the end of the century. And what physics tells us unequivocally is we will never reach this level of overshoot. We will never be this deep underwater. Before we get here, critical Earth system processes start to fall apart, as does human civilization. We will eventually be sustainable, but those sustainable trajectories are unplanned and chaotic and catastrophic. What we want is a planned trajectory to a sustainable level that reduces planetary impact and improves human well-being. And it's from a picture like that that we get a quote like this from climate scientist Kevin Anderson: "There are no non-radical futures." Doing a planned transition to a sustainable state will require radically transforming the way our civilization operates, starting with its economic system. If we choose not to do that, our future will also be radically different, but in a much worse way. This is entirely a question of innovation. Economists often answer what I've just said with the notion of, why are you so down on human innovation? We humans always find a way. And the answer is, those of us who understand where we're heading with growth are not down on innovation. The innovation is we will find a way to do a civilization without an economic system that must grow in order to thrive. That is what we need to be putting our minds on. That's what 100 million minds need to be working on. We will never, ever innovate a way around basic physics. We are not going to innovate our way to a perpetual motion machine. So I'll close with this then. Let's go back to climate change. What does an authentic energy transition look like? We are currently a 20 terawatt civilization, almost entirely fossil fuels. We need to transform that transition to an energy system that is entirely renewable and zero carbon, but it is also smaller by roughly a factor of 2. The transition from fossils to renewables is not enough. And in fact, it's not even happening right now. We're not displacing any fossil fuels, as you saw earlier. We are only adding to them. We need to actually replace the fossils with the zero carbon, and we need to use less. We need to use a different kind of energy, and we need to use less of it. This is our current plan for energy through the end of the century. This is what an authentic energy transition must look like. Currently, we are not even converging on an answer, much less actually getting an answer. Okay, so this has been a story of a biophysical system, our economy, that has moved from an infancy to an adolescence and now must mature. It needs, like all living things, it needs to reach a mature state in which it is no longer growing. Chapter 1 is growth will end. Chapter 2 is post-growth. How do we get there? And I'll give you just a very quick graphic. We have overshot our sustainable limit. If we choose to continue on our current pathway, there's only one place this ends. It's like running at a sprint and trying to continue that forever. We move to overshoot and collapse. What we need to do instead is reduce how fast we're running to a sustainable limit. We call that degrowth. That is a planned reduction in our civilizational metabolism that is democratically planned and that reduces ecological pressures and simultaneously increases human well-being. There are frameworks to do this. We understand the basics of how to do an economy this way. And once we have reduced our civilizational metabolism to a sustainable scale, we can then transition to what we might call a dynamic equilibrium state, where human development continues. We get better. We improve our lives. We improve the situations around us. We improve the quality of how we live without increasing energy and resource use. We move from an unsustainable sprint to a nice sustainable jog. Thank you all for your attention. I appreciate it. Hopefully, I know this sounds daunting, but I'll just say that it's also clarifying as to what actually constitutes authentic progress and what doesn't. And lots of what we consider to be authentic progress, for example, transitioning to zero carbon and increasing efficiency, is actually making the problem worse in the current economic paradigm we're embedded in. And this helps us then see where the work actually has to happen. Thanks all for listening. And now I think we've got a little bit of time for questions. I'm going to see if I can stop sharing. Here we go.
Thank you, Rob, so much. Very enlightening, as always. I'm seeing questions in the meeting chat that are asking about, what is some of this? What are these alternative economic systems? Maybe what work is being done on post-growth futures, et cetera. Could you enlighten us a little bit? Some people were saying they were a little down. It seemed daunting. So anything you could offer on some great possibilities for us, please?
It is daunting. But again, I want to use this word clarifying. Now we know what actually has to happen in concert. It's not that one thing has to happen or another. It's lots of things have to happen. Do we need to be more efficient with our resource use? Absolutely. But unless we plug that efficiency into a new economic system, it's only accelerating us over the cliff. So if you look up the terms post-growth or degrowth, you'll find all kinds of information. You'll find lots of disinformation. So I'm going to type just a couple of things into the chat here. There's a book called Less is More by Jason Hickel. I think this is an excellent resource to understand the basics of what a degrowth economic system might look like and the policies that are needed. So I want to say, in broad answer to that question, we have a framework for that. We understand the basic way that needs to work. That does not mean all the details of implementing that are figured out. In fact, they definitely are not. Everything in our global civilization now requires growth. Everything. So it's daunting to transition away from something that doesn't require growth. A degrowth does not mean unplanned reduction in economic activity. That's what we call a recession. Degrowth is how you avoid a recession and then a crash. So the answer is, I think, very much goes to Greg Terra.do's mission. The reason we don't have all the details figured out is because almost no one is working on it. We have all of the resources and all of the mental energy being poured into the other thing. How do we grow the economy? And we'll call it green growth or sustainable growth, but there's no such thing. It's just another term for growth. In an aggregate sense, the human civilizational metabolism has got to get smaller. Now, within that, certain sectors of the economy definitely have to grow. Let's say zero carbon energy, for example, needs to grow. Zero pesticides, zero till food, plant-based food solutions need to grow. And within that degrowth umbrella, certain national economies have to grow. In fact, roughly 80% of the people on the planet do not consume enough to meet basic levels of thriving. But in order for those national economies to grow and for those sectors that need to grow, other national economies and other sectors need to shrink, such that the net effect is a reduced human civilizational metabolism by roughly a factor of 2. Roughly speaking, our global civilizational economy needs to be about half the size that it is today. And we want to transition to that in a non-chaotic and democratically planned way. And to do that, we're going to need millions of people figuring out how to do that. And once we have that, there's every reason to believe that that is possible. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. You just mentioned, you just talked about this a little bit, but I'll just add this question to even dig deeper into it. There's a question on Slido. It's easy to advocate for slower growth when we are already in a developed economy, but how do we convince this is the way forward for non-developed economies? And I know you just touched on that, but would you mind going a little more, a little deeper?
No, that's great. So when we talk about actually degrowing national economies, we're talking about the high-income countries. Low-income countries need to grow their economies, but they need to grow them not along the same paradigm that we have been growing for the last century. It can't be simply producing stuff to grow economic activity. We're moving into a much more resource and energy constrained future, starting now. We will be more resource and more energy constrained. And when you're in that situation and 80% of the population isn't consuming enough, you need to ask yourself, well, what are we using our resources for? And so one of the broad categories of the framework for implementing degrowth is we have to prioritize. We have to say, you know what? We're not using our resources to build super yachts and to build 4,000-pound personal vehicles to take us 3 blocks down the street. We're using our resources not for personal, here's just an example, not for personal 5,000-pound personal vehicles, but for mass public transportation. We are using our resources and energy and materials not for advertising. For example, just all kinds of, I'm sitting here at my desk and I can just about everything on my desk is not only not a necessity, it's just a piece of plastic crap that somebody built to make money. Here we go. Here's something to hold a piece of paper. Do we need an industry making these things? Absolutely not. And if you walk into any store, look at every product, there's a factory behind it, and almost none of it is improving our lives. It was all designed to simply make money, to simply grow capital. And so we need to grow our economy in a way that is growing the things that we need and not spending energy and resources on things that are absolutely superfluous. So that's kind of a rough outline of the framework. Yes, lots of national economies need to grow, but not in the way that we have been.
Great, thanks. There have been some questions asking, what are some of the economic models for degrowth, and are there organizations working on this? What organizations exist that are rising to the occasion? Could you share a little bit on that?
Almost none. So more is happening in Europe than here in the United States. I'm going to give you a couple of names. Oh, sorry, I just posted the book, Less is More. Jason Hickel is a good one to look up. Another one is Timothy Perique. He's French. If you look up him and look for video called, I think it's called Slow Down. It's about an hour long. Is an excellent explanation of degrowth and what it means and what it doesn't mean, and the kind of the models for moving forward with this. So the good news is we have a framework, but there's a lot more to be done. We have to commit ourselves to that framework, and then it's like climbing the mountain. You don't know every step to the top of the mountain. In order to figure out the last step, you've got to figure out all the steps before that. And we're at the bottom of the mountain. We need to figure out what are the next steps. And the good news is there are lots and lots of next steps. And I'll just refer you to Timothy Perique. Also has a really good blog that deals with debunking a lot of the disinformation about degrowth as well. So let me start with that. Yeah.
Great, thanks. I'm just kind of scrolling. So Leanne, who's a longtime Terra.do supporter. Hi, Leanne. Great to see you again. She asked who the 12 individuals are. Someone shared that, but asked, how can you suggest we work to increase the political power of the masses? Do you have any suggestions there?
Right. So this is the part of the story where we've talked about stories within stories within stories, and there's quite a bit we haven't gotten to yet. So the question you're getting to, and I'm just going to type in a couple of things here for you to look up. One of them is called the multipolar trap. It's part of game theory, which has to do with the strategic relations between competing actors. Another term for that is Moloch. I'm not sure if it's one L or two. But basically, the question is, we've got all of these efforts moving to try to fix all of these ecological problems and social problems, and they are only getting worse. Now, you'll hear people cherry pick data and take it out of context and say, oh, this metric is getting better, and this metric is getting better, this metric is getting better. But when you look in aggregate, we find everything's getting worse. So when you hear someone say, well, this is getting better, you have to say for who and where and when. So the question is, we've got all of these things happening. They're getting worse. There are thousands of organizations working to try to get them better, but nothing's getting better. Pesticide use is going up. Toxic pollution going up. Plastic pollution going up. All of the things that we all agree we don't want to happen. Climate change is intensifying. We don't want that to happen. Species are going extinct. We don't want that to happen. We're wiping out critical ecosystems. We don't want that to happen, yet all it does is happen. And the reason is that there are structural incentive, there are incentive layers of perverse incentives built into our cultural and economic system that kind of force us to do all the things we all agree we don't want to be done because the short-term incentive structures go to the first mover advantages. So for example, if any of you saw the movie Oppenheimer, a classic example of a multipolar trap is an arms race or a tragedy of the commons. So let's take the arms race. If you saw the movie Oppenheimer, there's a part where there's a physicist, Robbie, who doesn't want to work on this project. He tells Oppenheimer, he says, look, this is a terrible thing to be building, this atomic weapon. We don't want this thing, and I'm going to have nothing to do with it. And Oppenheimer agrees. But he says, look, I don't know if we will be good stewards of this awesome power, but I know the Nazis will not be. And they're trying to build this also. And this is a classic arms race. What if the tech that you're working on, if the system that you're working in conveys a particular competitive advantage in a competitive environment, then that technology becomes obligate. So you can choose not to develop the nuclear weapon, but then the other side develops the nuclear weapon and they either just wipe you out or take you over or whatever. And so you're forced to do it yourself. And this happens throughout our economy, throughout our world. There's all these things happening that we don't want to happen, the introduction of toxic chemicals, but they happen because there is intense first mover advantage to doing that thing. It gets you short-term advantage, it gets you profit. And in our system, whose goal is not well-being, But in growth, if that doing that thing gets you growth, then you do it. And you do it, and if you don't do it, then somebody else does, and they put you out of business. So transitioning our society, you kind of think about what we need to do. We need to transition the infrastructure. But in order to transition the infrastructure, we need to transition the social structure. Think of it as the social technology, the institutions that we have. And that includes our economic system. We need that social structure to transition. And if we don't transition that social structure, the transition of the infrastructure helps us not at all. In fact, it can make it worse. But there's one more layer, and that's our culture. Why do we have the social structure that we have? It's because of the cultural system that we have. Some people refer to this as the superstructure. And that is having to do with how many of us do not understand that we are embedded in this living system, right? This amazing living system that took billions of years to create an environment in which we can survive and thrive. We are disassembling that because we see ourselves separate from it, not even needing it. That's certainly the way neoclassical economics treats the environment. It's not in any of the models. There is no nature in any of those models. It's a cultural worldview that we sometimes call dualism, where we see ourselves separate from nature, as opposed to the worldview that we had for most of humanity's 300,000-year history, which is animism, which is seeing ourselves very much as part of nature. I want to type in a name here, Damon Gamow. He's an Australian filmmaker. Look up his TED Talk. I think it's called The Stories We Tell Ourselves or something about that. Stories. It's 12 minutes long, I think. It's a brilliant exposition of this notion of worldview. And so what I love about this is I know that, Greg, you've now taught this course to thousands and thousands of people. Your reach is growing. And lots of those of you who are sitting in on this probably are not environmental scientists and don't want to be environmental scientists. And in fact, we don't need any more environmental scientists. We're going to get more, and that will help. But this is primarily not a question of us not knowing enough about the environment or not having enough technology. We have the technology we need to transition, make these transitions we need. We have the knowledge we need when it comes to physics. What we don't have is the social technology. And so this is almost entirely a cultural challenge at this point. And so even though it's incredibly daunting, it's also clarifying. So if your jam is has to do with justice, has to do with equitability, has to do with politics, has to do with international relations, has to do with communication, then this is the work for you. This is where all of the work is because in order for us to transition our social structures, we have to transition our superstructure, our culture. And then we can transition the infrastructure in a way that helps. And without all three of those working together, I see no way out of this. It's daunting, but now we see where the work is to do. And so if you look up, I'm going to put one more. I'm going to put one more name in here, and with a big asterisk. The name is Daniel Schmachtenberger. I think he's probably the most sophisticated thinker on all of this that we have. If you just Google him, you will find dozens and dozens of podcast interviews of Daniel. I got to tell you, though, you got to be ready for Daniel. He's incredibly engaging. He's incredibly bright. But he's kind of next level. But I've not found anyone who puts all of these together in the most coherent narrative possible. And if you want to understand what is meaningful action, what is authentic progress, and what can I be doing to work on those things, I think a good place to start is to start by understanding these narratives that Daniel paints. And you'll see what I mean if you listen to it.
Thank you so much, Rob, for joining us for this incredible presentation. And for everyone here, he's speaking to all of us. We are the ones to make this change, to lead the way forward to where we need to go. So thank you to all of you as well. Join me, if you don't mind, find a reaction, and let's thank Rob for joining us today. Really appreciate this, Rob. For the questions, we will share the recording. Rob, is it possible to share your slides with us? Maybe
I
a PDF of
can.
those or something, or
I certainly can. I find that they're not a whole lot of use to people without the words.
okay, sure.
But
And
I can certainly share them.
okay, yeah, great. And we can, I will pull these links out of here and share those as well, the suggested resources. I'm seeing people ask about that. And then we had a quick question. Thank you all. We're way past time, so please feel free to drop off. But a few folks were asking, what program did you use to make the cool graphics and animations? Because they thought it was really great.
Yeah, I see a bunch of questions as to who the artist was too. So I actually make my own graphics. And I used Apple's Keynote software. It's kind of Apple's version of PowerPoint. I find it just easier to use and more powerful than PowerPoint. Having said that, though, I haven't used PowerPoint in a long time now, so I don't really know what it's like to use PowerPoint anymore. But yeah.
Yeah, awesome. And Rob, do you have just a moment for anyone who needs to drop? Please drop. Dan Potter, you had a question. I'm trying to find it in the chat. Do you mind just saying it if you're still with us?
I'm happy to stay for as long as people want to stay.
Okay, great. Thank you.
We all appreciate the extra time. You mentioned a couple times this process, this degrowth or post-growth process needs to be democratic. Can you just talk about why that's important? Why making it a democratic process is important?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'll say that people like Timothy Parikh and Jason Hickel, Parikh in particular, talks really eloquently about that notion. Let me frame this. Let me just back up just a little bit, and this won't take long, but I think it's useful. On our current trajectory, we're dealing with some pretty complex dynamics here. We're dealing with lots of overlapping exponential growth curves. There's exponential tech, there's exponential economic growth, there's exponential economic investment, there's exponential impacts on the environment, lots and lots of exponential curves. Embedded in these layer upon layer of perverse incentive structures. The question is, where does this go? And there's kind of, in the world of complex dynamics, you make mathematical models, and there's this term called an attractor state. An attractor state is kind of, think about, a marble on an edge, and it can go one way or another. And it's only one of two ways, and each way is what we might call an attractor state. It's going to end up over here somewhere. So the most likely attractor states for our human civilization right now are either collapse into chaos, or that's just where we crash through our biophysical limit. The biosphere is collapsing, where we've got increasingly constrained energy and resource use combined with increasingly intense ecological and social disruptions, basically leading to systems collapse and chaos and all kinds of. So that's one attractor state right now. Another attractor state is very intense authoritarian control. You have basically military force seizing control of governments, imposing all kinds of constraints on resources, and you kind of end up with this fortress world where you have the fortunate elite surrounded by the rest of us who are existing in a very poor state. We'll call that an authoritarian dystopia. So the two attractor states right now are sort of authoritarian dystopia or collapse into chaos. We need sort of a third place to go. And I think we can all agree that the authoritarian world is not preferable either, because what happens there is the status quo. In the system we're in, it's a kind of a success to the successful feedback loop. The people who have all of the wealth have all the power. Money is just power. It's a sort of this infinitely fungible sort of token that allows you to exchange it for anything. And one of the things we can exchange it for is power. And so if you can imagine an authoritarian state in which the people for whom things are working pretty well and want to insulate themselves against all these effects it's authoritarian. So we need, in order for the big changes that we need to actually be accepted and to move us to vibrancy, they need to be democratically chosen. And there's a really good example of this in France. There's others, but let's just take France most recently with the Yellow Vest movement that has been protesting all kinds of things. Very recently, one of the things they protested were taxes on all kinds of fuels that were intended to get France in line with their climate change targets under the IPCC Paris Agreement. But these were hugely unpopular with people who are less wealthy and have huge dependence on fossil fuels. Farmers are one of them. And so these changes were just sort of made by edict from the French government. Here's what we're going to do. And it resulted in massive disruptive protests. One of the ways that France addressed this was to create these sort of citizens' democratic councils. They picked demographically diverse people, I think a couple of hundred, formed them into a climate council and said, meet, learn about climate change, come up with a whole suite of recommendations, which they did. And some of the recommendations they came up with were the same recommendations the French government was trying to implement anyway, although the implementation was different. But it was democratically planned. And so its acceptance among these proposed changes were very popular among the French public. They were not popular among the French parliament because the French parliament is largely comprises people who are in the higher end of the economic side. And so if you plan them democratically, what you end up with are changes that actually improve lives for the vast majority of the citizens. Most of the world's citizens don't need to reduce their consumption. Most of the consumption is at the very tippy top. And so the democratically planned is the notion there in degrowth is you actually have to wait to implement it. And if you're not going to try to implement it into an authoritarian society, which I think we all agree is not vibrant, and you're going to implement it into a democratic society, then these changes that you're talking about have to be agreed upon democratically and formulated democratically. So it's a key piece in the post-growth framework for actually implementing the policy changes that are required.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And people are sticking around. Do you have a few more minutes? I might just ask people.
I'm here for as long as you want to stay.
Okay. I see some other questions in the chat. I'm just going to invite people to, do you mind just voicing your questions? Like Mark, would you like to come off mute and ask a question? Or Wasabi, go for it. Sorry, Mark, I'm going to actually, let's go Mark, and then we'll come back. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can formulate it better, but I think it kind of just goes off of what you're saying. How do we actually hold people accountable who have purposeful negligence, who understand that they are causing harm, but they don't care? And eventually, whether it's climate related or anything else, we just keep finding these companies that don't actually change practices, or they find alternative practices to constantly consume more. So how do we not go into more of a severe or similar authoritarian practices, right, where we try and take over them and sort of the poor kind of just revolting in a way, right? And how do we actually provide democratic policies that we can hold these massive corporations accountable for some of their actions? Because it seems like they just obviously don't care, right? Because they just want to get richer and have more growth, and we're here with our hands tied behind our backs, right?
So it's an excellent question, and I'm going to use a phrase that I use very often. I haven't used it today yet. I use it with my students almost every day when we're going through this material. This is not a story about villains. This is a story about systems, which is not to say that there aren't villains. There are most definitely villains, and we can identify many of them. But if you get the system right, the villains don't matter. The right system does not amplify the influence and the power of the villains. It de-amplifies it. But the system we're in, this growth-based system that demands growth, so we can call corporations and the people who run them villains if we want. Let's take the fossil fuel industry. We all use the fossil fuels, and their mandate by law is not to serve the well-being of humanity. Their mandate is to maximize shareholder return. That's it. We all think the CEO of the insurance company is a villain when they deny the cancer treatment to the little girl or the old man or whoever it is. But that CEO is just doing what the law requires them to do, what the system presses them to do, which is an insurance company does not exist to provide health care for anybody. It exists to make money for its shareholders. So one of the things that needs to transition is our whole system of business, our whole system of, let's call it purpose-driven and steward-owned businesses is what we want. But until we change the system, then the entities that we think of as villainous are simply behaving according to these sort of multipolar traps, right? Even if the people running the company don't want to do the bad thing, they are forced to. If they don't, they just get replaced by someone who will. And I think BP has had that experience in the last decade or so, or 2 decades with their CEOs. You get a CEO of BP who says, yeah, we're actually going to prioritize, the well-being of the planet. And guess what? Gone. Next CEO comes in and it's, no, we're maximizing shareholder return. So how you actually get there, though, is tricky, right? The question is, how do you get out of a multipolar trap? And in the world of game theory, there is a way out. And oftentimes multipolar traps are referred to as failures of coordination. So there's this shitty thing that everybody agrees shouldn't happen, but all of the short-term incentive structures force us to do that. It's like 2 villages using a forest, and they say, yeah, we agree we want to use the forest sustainably. We're not going to take more than we need. But then you discover that if you take a little more than you need, you can build an army, you can build a navy. And you say to yourselves, well, if we know this, then the other village knows this. And we don't want to invade the other village, but we're not sure if they want to invade us. So we better actually take a little more and build up our army. This is an arms race. And the other village says, oh my God, they're taking more than they need and they're building an army. We're going to need to build an army. Now, both villages agreed they want to use the forest sustainably. But the incentive structure and the first mover advantage, the one to get the biggest army the fastest, is the one that builds their security, right? So what you need between those 2 villages is much more open and transparent coordination so that they're both certain that the other is not doing the thing that nobody wants them to do. Now, is that easy? Do we know how to do that internationally and all of that? I mean, no. But the question is, how much effort do we actually expend on doing that versus how much effort we expend on building massive militaries? So when you think about 1 million minds working on these problems, tens of hundreds of millions of minds working on these problems, if we had all of the minds working on how do we build more awesome, AI weaponry, and all of those minds were working on how do we do the coordination, I think the chances are good we get a lot further than we have. Does that mean we can do it perfectly? I mean, obviously nobody can say that, no. But can we do it a whole lot better than we do? Absolutely. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is rounding it back to your question, which is how do we emasculate the villains? How do we cut the legs out from under them? We have got to get ourselves to a system in which the short-term incentive structures no longer drive us to do those things. And massively amplifying the effective levels of coordination that we can do is one piece of that puzzle. And if you don't do that, there's kind of there's no way to disempower them. So in order to use the infrastructure the way that you want to use it, you've got to have the social structure. And that means that the social structure has got to bind the bad stuff. There has to be economic policy. There has to be laws. But those things don't hold if they're not in concurrence with the superstructure, the culture. If the culture isn't demanding that this is the case, we don't allow insurance companies who don't, well, basically we don't need insurance companies because we provide health insurance for everybody. That's kind of the culture. We don't do things that are going to be, we don't introduce new products into the world, new chemicals, let's say, that are dangerous, that we think might be dangerous before we've tested them thoroughly, really thoroughly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's, the answers to your question are found in this world of game theory. And I think they're absolutely critical. But again, they're daunting, but again, they're clarifying. All of this work on energy efficiency is for naught if you don't get the superstructure right and the social structure right.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And Wasabi, did you have a question still?
Yes, thank you for a great presentation. I just want clarification on one of your previous slide where you had the graph what we said right now we are using 1.8 planet, and in maybe at the end of a century we might use 7 planets. If we keep it going there, it will be sustainable on its own. If it will be unplanned, but the planet will be back.
Yeah, okay. So I'm gonna quickly share my screen and bring up that graphic.
It's like okay, so yes, there will be wars and pain, but how did it come? What does it mean to be back to sustainable in 7 planets? If you could clarify that.
So so this is the graphic, is that right?
Yeah, yes.
And so so we're currently roughly a factor of 2 into overshoot of our resources. That's this 1.8. Is that clear?
Yes.
Okay. So here's a piece of data I left out. So our current economic plan, all the countries, all the the G20, the big economic powerhouses say, in order for us to have a thriving global economy, we need to grow our economy at 3% annually. 3%. If you grow anything at 3% annually, it will double in size in about 23 years. That's the doubling time for 3% growth. So that's kind of, here we are at roughly factor of 2 overshoot, right? Let's go 2 decades further down, and we're a factor of 4 in overshoot. So we've doubled. That's at 3% growth. And you do that, you continue to do that, and you get to a factor of 8 overshoot in the next 20 years after that. That's kind of down around here. Now, I haven't quite kept up with that rate because we're not really growing at 3%. It's kind of more like 2.5 or 2.6 or 2.7, but you get the idea. From an economic standpoint, the plan is to grow the economy at 3% and double it every 2.5 decades. From a metabolic, biophysical standpoint, that means making yourself deeper and deeper unsustainably very quickly. Now, I think what I said was, let me just do this. We're not going to get to anywhere near this level of overshoot down here. We're at a factor of overshoot of 1.8 right now, and look at the ecological disruptions that we have wreaked. As the chances that we get to a level of 4 planets worth of overshoot are essentially 0. So on our current trajectory, if we just keep going that way, no degrowth, no anything like that, we just plow ahead. And this is what the economists tell us we must do. They tell us that economic growth is you got to do that. And this is how all policy is planned. No policy gets passed without assessing its effect on economic growth. And if your policy is negative, affects economic growth negatively, then it's very unlikely to get passed. So this is our current trajectory. So somewhere, along this trajectory, almost certainly kind of at this level here before we get to 4 planets, we crash. We crash the global economy because the ecosystems can no longer keep up, because the climate disruptions are enormous, because the social disruptions are enormous. So that's just economic growth crashes. Well, that's catastrophic for billions of people and billions of creatures. That's just this unplanned wham. And after a very short time, you're back up here into the sustainable level, right? You're unsustainable. When you crash, you get back down to a or in this case, you get yourself out of being from underwater. You come back to a sustainable level, but the state that you're in is terrible. It's lots of resource conflict. It's billions of people unemployed, most businesses out of business, sort of a state of ecological and social catastrophe. That's the unplanned, chaotic route. And that's kind of what I'm illustrating. The deeper we go into unsustainability until the crash, the worse the crash. That's not what we want. What we want, of course, is this route here, which is planned and not chaotic, therefore. And we want to end up at a state that's not terrible, but and if we do it right, the idea is that we end up in a place where we're all much better off. And there's a solid framework for doing that. We do not need the hyper levels of consumption that we in the high-income countries have to be happy. In fact, there's lots of evidence to tell us that once you reach a certain base level of consumption, where you feel like you are physically and socially secure, once you reach that level, additional consumption actually makes us less happy. There's data to this effect, quite a lot of it. So the idea is, if we plan it correctly, we have to democratically plan it. The changes have to reduce ecological pressures. That's the reducing here. And they're designed to make people's lives better. How is that? Well, they improve living metrics for most of the planet, and they reduce the consumption largely for the most consumptive 20% on the planet. I'm an American. Because of my salary at a university, I fit just barely within the wealthiest 10% people on the planet. Not in my country, but I fit within the wealthiest 10% on the planet. I suspect Greg does as well. And my level of consumption is about twice that of the average European. Europeans have better outcomes in social metrics in just about every category than Americans. So right there, that's data that tells me that those of us in America should be able to reduce our consumptions by half and actually end up with better social outcomes. There's a way to do that, as demonstrated by most Europeans. Now, most Europeans are also over-consuming. So that brings into effect the notion that, okay, now you really need to start being prioritizing. What are we going to spend our energy and resources on? And rethinking and planning our civilization so that we're doing that, smartly, wisely. We're not doing that yet. But then again, almost no one is trying to do that. If we have millions of minds, tens of millions of minds working on that problem, then I think we get somewhere. If we don't, then we are destined to one of these rapid crashes. Or in the case of my little metaphor here, where we're underwater, these very rapid decompressions, which wreak havoc for billions of people. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, thanks all. I've got 2 more hands raised, and Rob, if you're okay, I think we'll go ahead and take those 2 questions, but then maybe cap it there, just because we're already 30 minutes over, taking a lot of your time. Appreciate it so much. So, Karnik, would you like to ask your question, please?
Hi, sure. So, first of all, thanks so much, Robert. It was, really enlightening, to be very honest. So I wanted to understand, a little bit better about the systemic change path that you were talking about, right? And it's obvious that that is a change that really cannot be brought about by individualistic understanding of how it works. And obviously, there are a lot of factors involved in that as well. But I wanted to understand, based on your perception and experience, if you had to make a sort of roadmap on how to really get to a system like that, even if it's idealistic and obviously there are moving parts, how would you sort of structure that? I mean, I want to understand what it is that ideally it is that we should be aiming for, and then maybe solving those things along the way. So how do you really look at that?
Yeah. So I've been studying this for quite a while, let's say 15 years, 20 years. It's taken me that amount of time, that's 15 plus years, to get to what I would say this level of understanding of the meta crisis and the predicament that we're in. It doesn't need to take that long for other people to understand it. I'm trained as a physicist. And yeah, for 15 years, I've been studying food systems and energy systems and economic systems, and complex systems, and now things like game theory. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in any of those. I don't know how to run a business. I don't know how to run a community. So I'm going to go back to this thing that I've said before, and it's not a dodge on your question. It's my actual answer. I am not the person to ask how to get us all those steps to the top of the mountain. I don't think anyone is. But there are people out there who have very different experiences. They have very different skill sets. People who know how to run businesses, who know how to do, are really great at conflict resolution and really great at relations, are really great at social justice issues. My answer is, right now, we have so many people in this world. My students are this way. They know the world they live in is absolutely fucking nuts. I apologize. They sense that. But in their programs in our universities, they're basically being told that the way out of these things is more of the same behavior that got us here, just with cooler tech. There's this massive belief in technology, when the actual case evidence to the effect is that the technology is not the issue. It's our culture. It's our worldview. It's the systems that we have created that are put us on a physically impossible path. So what I like to do is I like to talk about it this way, and I promise I'm almost done with my answer. I like to think of this landscape that we inhabit of fully interconnected ecological and social challenges. This catastrophic risk landscape. Almost nobody in our society has a good map of this landscape. They don't understand the features that are in the landscape, the hyper-unsustainability, the climate change, the biodiversity loss, the hyper-inequity, the massive crisis in epistemology, the information. They have a sense that those things are there, but they don't understand them very well. So they don't understand the features in the landscape. They don't understand how those features are connected. They don't understand the tectonic forces that have given rise to that landscape, and are therefore completely unable to navigate through that landscape. And to the extent that we give a compass to our citizens, to the students that I have and the rest of that compass points in exactly the wrong direction. More growth. My theory of change is, and it sounds like it's a similar theory to Terra.do's change. I'm in the process of creating an entire entity, an institute called the Institute for Planetary Thinking. And our bumper sticker for what does the Institute for Planetary Thinking want to do is millions of minds with a good map and a good compass. I personally think the very next, I said you can't identify every step to the top of the mountain. We have to identify the next steps, right? Here's the next steps that I have identified that I think are the most powerful. We have to have millions of minds who understand this landscape and have a good compass, and the compass points in the direction of growth. We have to use less. And we have to do it in a democratic and controlled, planned way. And we can do that. There are frameworks for that. What we need now are millions and millions of people filling in the frameworks, millions of business owners saying, okay, how do I get my business to be purpose-driven and steward-owned? And there are tools for that. We have lots of tools for that. What does it mean and it's going to be different for different businesses and different communities in different countries, right? These are all, how do I get that, how do we create that superstructure of culture that recognizes our place in nature? The answer to that is going to be different for different cultures currently. What we need, I can't figure that out for every business owner, for every person in every community in every country, and people, no one like me can. No one of us can do all of that. So the very next step, the roadmap that I have for you, it's a great question, and I understand it, is the more people who have a good map and a good compass, the better chance we have of navigating this landscape. So that, to my mind, that is the very first step. And then what those millions of people do with it, I think, is what takes us where we need to go. It's a path we have to constantly course correct and constantly invent as we go. But we don't have to invent the next steps. The next steps are clear. And so for me, that's millions of minds with a good map and a right compass. That's the best I can do for you.
No, thanks, Rob. And I'll just highlight that we are some of those
Thank you.
millions of minds right here.
Absolutely. You all are exactly what you do with this information. I don't know, but I suspect it's going to be great. I mean, I suspect that's going to move us forward. I teach this material primarily to fine arts and humanities students. They're the ones who are plugged into the cultural institutions. They're the ones who are going to figure out how to tell the story much better than I can tell the story to a much broader audience, to make it, to do that work. And so and when their final projects are to do that, to tell the story to somebody. And the only guidance I give them is do whatever you want. I'm certainly not there to tell you how to tell this story in your own way, through your own worldview, with your own tools, to whatever audience you choose. I'm going to trust that when we get a large, diverse section of us in this world who understand the landscape with a good compass, then we're going to start figuring it out. If we are.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Nick, we're going to make you the last question. Thanks for hanging with us. And then Rob, thank you as well for sticking with us for all of this. It's fantastic.
Rod, thank you so much. And you kind of just really touched on my question with that last answer. My question is, do you see anyone in the political landscape, nationally or globally, who has that compass, or at least acknowledges that compass, or at least acknowledges the need for going in this direction? Someone that we can be aware of, that maybe we can kind of pay attention to. And if not, we might not be there yet.
In the political landscape. Short answer is no. Longer answer is maybe. There are a few countries. New Zealand is one. Scotland, I realize, is kind of I'm never quite sure what Scotland is. Part of the United Kingdom. Sometimes they act like they're part of the United Kingdom. Sometimes they have their own deal. So Iceland, Scotland, New Zealand are some examples of countries who have instituted what I would say the precursors to moving in this direction, which is a much more comprehensive dashboard of metrics that they use to assess the well-being of their populations. New Zealand in particular is the best. If you look up, Google New Zealand, maybe well-being dashboard or something like that, it'll get you to a website. They've created something like 150 metrics that they use to assess the well-being of their population. Scotland and Iceland have kind of done similar things. There's a few other countries as well. But the idea is, let's start assessing our well-being with far more than GDP. And we give lip service here in the United States to having other metrics, but when it comes to making policy, the only metric we use is GDP. And these countries are starting to require all policy to be filtered through these much more comprehensive dashboards. So they're, I'm trying to think of her name, the New Zealand Prime Minister who just retired, Jacinda something, is an example of a politician who I would say, I think she understands. I think there are probably more politicians out there who understand than I know about, but there's no way that they can talk about these things and get elected. If you think climate change is a hard discussion, you should try economic growth. At least with climate change, there's roughly half the political landscape that understands. In fact, it's more than half that understands this is a real problem and want to change it. When you start talking about economic growth, good luck finding a politician of any stripe, conservative or liberal, progressive, regressive. They all want economic growth. And they all understand that if they start talking to their demographics, to their electorate about we need to shrink the size of the economy, that they will be laughed off stage and never see office again. So I think there are probably politicians out there who understand this, but they can't articulate it. And that's kind of okay, right? I mean, I don't need every politician to talk about degrowth to every person all the time. We do need the politicians to know where the goalposts are. And then you navigate to get to those goalposts. But if you don't know where the goalposts are, then you're just navigating in the wrong direction, which I would say is most of us, most of our politicians. So I don't know politicians that are that get it. Even the most progressive politicians here in the United States, Bernie Sanders or Ocasio-Cortez, they still talk about growth. They call it green growth. But green growth is not a thing. At least not the way they talk about it. So I don't. But we have got to provide the cultural transition that allows democratic politicians to talk about things in this way.
Yeah, thanks for the questions, everyone. Rob Davies, thank you so very much for joining us and sharing with us today. I think this has been fantastic. Really just want to thank you. There's a question. Are you open to getting emails from folks to answer more questions?
Of course. And I don't, let me just type my email address in here.
Thank you.
Feel free to contact me. Did I get that in there?
Yes.
I don't. Oh, there it is. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thank all of you, and thank all of you for the work that you're spending the time and the resources you have to take this course. And thank you, Greg, for doing the amazing job that you do.
Yeah, thanks all. All right. Take care, everybody. And thank you so much. We'll see you in class and elsewhere. All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.